Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today to our HR Matters series. We're here today to talk about performance reviews. Still important in the COVID era. We were just talking amongst ourselves a minute ago about how last year, and maybe this is true for you, a lot of these types of best practices sort of fell by the wayside because of the pandemic and sort of just trying to keep businesses afloat and people employed and making those types of decisions. And so our goal today, and we at Dominion Payroll are still, we were in the same boat. We were able to revive our process in the late 2020, but it definitely was on pause for a little while as we focused on other things. So we're trying to practice what we preach. And so I thought today would be a good opportunity as we move into March of 2021, which is crazy that we're already in March, to talk about performance reviews and to either refresh or maybe have an initial conversation with you about what this could mean for your company, what the benefits are, what are some potential approaches, what are some handy tips, and how you can, get this stood up in your organization, large or small. We're always happy to help and answer questions. So if you'd like to ask a question today, please type it into the Q&A on your screen, and we will get that answered for you and do our very best to help you out. My returning guest today is Emily from Mammoth HR. Hi, Emily.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here today.
And Emily, as you know, has been with us, I don't know how many times now, a handful, 4 or 5 maybe, since last summer. We invite her and her counterpart, Kim, to join us and just join me and to discuss these topics. So we're lucky to have her. She's very busy and helping people from coast to coast. So thank you, Emily, for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And I know that you all are, and we talked earlier, you were part of an internal team to really take a look at performance reviews and to lay out, really define the impact, the importance of them and the impact that they can have on a company and a culture and retention. So we're excited to have you here with that firsthand knowledge, because what we'll do today is we'll go through some reasons why they're important, but we'll also go through some different approaches, which I think is really important. I think what I see a lot is clients are using sort of the same template or approach to performance reviews as they always have had. The questions get a little stale. Maybe the process is a little stale, or maybe it's just not the right process for their culture. Maybe they've grown. Maybe the employees need a little bit more of a discussion-based format. So that's sort of the meat of our presentation today. And then we'll close out with some handy tips for you guys as you hopefully move into this activity in the coming year. All right. So as our title suggested, performance reviews still matter, even during a pandemic, even though your workforce is working remotely or maybe at a reduced capacity, or maybe they're back in the office, or maybe their roles have changed a little bit. It still is a great way to measure, monitor, and reward job performance, and which also has a direct impact on productivity, competitiveness, and your profitability. It also serves as an opportunity, and particularly in this strange time as we move hopefully towards the end of this pandemic, to reinforce positive behaviors, outcomes, and goals. We've all been sort of thrown a little bit sideways in the past 12 months. Maybe this is a good time to sort of reset and recalibrate what the focus of certain roles and departments are. Or maybe those roles and maybe those job responsibilities have changed because of the pandemic, or because of the remote situation. So going ahead and re-establishing this as a way to discuss and set those expectations and reinforce those positive behaviors, or maybe address some negative behaviors, is, and then document that and create that paper trail, is, I think, pretty important right now. And then, of course, employees, not all employees love performance reviews. It's definitely not everyone's favorite way to spend their time, but I think in the long run, everyone does want to know where they stand within the company, particularly now, and particularly if you've had some furloughs due to COVID and you've sort of shaken up your workforce. Maybe there's been some, like I said, shift in the business in terms of, you know, maybe maybe you're a brewery and now most of your sales are now online instead of in-house. Maybe some of your employees have shifted from being front of the house folks to shipping fulfillers. And how is that going? And is that the right fit for them? They might want to know, like, how long is this going to go on, do you think? And to the extent that you can answer that, you can reassure them that, yes, as soon as we get operations back and fully operational, you'll be back to what you were originally doing. Or maybe the employee likes the new gig and wants to stay. And gives you an opportunity to have that conversation. Emily, anything else to add here? I know that this is a sort of an interesting time for managers and employees alike.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but I think you brought up a really good point that now is the perfect time not only to reinvigorate doing performance reviews, but to make sure that you're doing them in a way that's meaningful for your organization and for your team. And if you've experienced a lot of change, that could mean that there's a change that would be beneficial in your process or in which type of form you use. Performance reviews are a large time commitment for you, if you're the HR person sort of planning it, for the managers, if you're writing them, for employees, if you're taking the time to listen and respond to that feedback. And they really only work if there's follow through and if there's a appropriate level of discussion. So now's the perfect time to sort of assess that before moving forward.
And speaking of timing, how often should we be conducting reviews is something that I hear often. And sort of the old way to do it, in my opinion, is to do them once a year. But I typically don't recommend that. I think it's sort of like setting a New Year's resolution and then abandoning it in February. If I have a conversation with my manager in February about my goals, and then we never speak of them again, it's likely that I probably won't reach them because either they're not top of mind, there's no monitoring, there's no keeping up with progress or changes or tweaking things, and then there's probably less of a reward too. So we recommend it to be more of an ongoing process, and we'll talk more about this in a second. But if you could even do it twice a year, I mean, I know, I agree with Emily, it's a time-consuming process. Hopefully it's a front-loaded process though, so that you'll do most of your hard work at the beginning and then it'll sort of go on autopilot. But it does require some time, and I know time is a premium for everybody. So, I'm not saying that you necessarily need to do a monthly appraisal, but if you could manage to sneak in a second one per year, I think that would be a really great start to making those more meaningful, because otherwise it's just a once a year conversation. Who can remember 11 months ago? If the goals aren't constantly reinforced or top of mind, then they're probably not going to be met. Emily, what are you hearing? Are you hearing that people are moving towards a semi-annual model or quarterly?
Yeah, so I would say the most common right now is twice a year. To your point, it's really hard to do annual reviews, even though maybe it's less actual hours spent at the computer typing reviews out. The other detriment, in addition to not having the proper follow through for goals, is you can run into what's called recency, where you end up only assessing the most recent performance. And we see this with employers and managers, but also with employees. Think about if your organization generally does a self review. I know I certainly have been in situations where I was supposed to provide feedback to my manager about how I've done over the course of the year. And I'm like, well, it's November. I honestly can't even remember what I was doing in January. So doing them more frequently and twice a year is probably the most palatable and approachable, is really great. And then the other sort of thing just to tack on to that is whether you're doing reviews once a year or twice a year or even more frequently than that, to your point, Lesley, performance discussions should be ongoing. So the performance meeting, even if it's only once a year, shouldn't be the only time that you're talking about these things.
Right. I mean, it's amazing to think, if I have been guilty of preparing for a performance review where I'm being reviewed, where I'm like, okay, I literally have to go back and look through my calendar to remember all that I have done. You know what I mean? Like, it's just you run the risk of, like you said, with recency, of not only addressing recent things, but also forgetting all that has occurred over the past 12 months. And, unless you're really good, I mean, maybe I should be better about documenting, but you get busy and life happens. And I think if employees or managers sort of grumble about adding another review to the cadence, you can remind them that this is a benefit to them. This is actually a good thing. Yes, it's a little bit more work. Yes, there are people who really dislike these types of conversations. And you can sort of help that by coaching managers and prepping them in a way that makes them feel more comfortable having conversations, particularly if it's going to be a difficult one. But at the long run, more frequency benefits everybody involved. All right, so what type of review is best? So these questions are, they're not rocket science, but they should be something that you're considering when you're thinking about what type of review would work best for your team. Like I said, most of the clients that I work with, they just have sort of a standard review template that they've used across the company for years and years and years. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but the organization has likely changed over that course of time. Or they might have, or maybe it's a brand new company and they need to start something fresh. This is a good way. These questions here are a good way to sort of recalibrate and remind yourself, what are the actual goals? What is your management's experience with reviews? Should your culture dictate which type of review you decide on? What's the type of work? And are you that experience level of your supervisors, if it's on what end of the spectrum, from no experience to super experienced. And it could be that's different by department, and you might have some departments that are much larger than others, so it's a heavier lift for some managers than others. And so you should definitely take that into consideration when you're looking at designing your review process. Emily, what types of questions, what types of sort of, if they're going to ask these questions, is this something that they should sit down with their leadership team and sort of work on together, or is it best practice for HR to just sort of plow forth and answer these themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends a lot on the makeup of the organization and who generally leads this process. So, to your point, if you have a management team that is really heavily invested in this process, or maybe is really well experienced in performance reviews, or you have a smaller organization where just the approach to decision making in the company is really collaborative, then I think it makes sense to involve everyone in this discussion, or everyone in your management team. If it's more a situation where maybe the owner and the HR person sort of lead this process, and there's a lot of sort of training or informing necessary, regardless of what you decide, to sort of make sure that everybody is on board and that everybody completes everything appropriately, then I think it makes more sense for that to be a conversation that's smaller in scope, and maybe the HR person leading the discussion about, like, here's what I think would work the best. And the other thing that I wanted to call out too was, I mean, I'm sure that there could be a situation, maybe if you have a warehouse and then you have, like a retail or an administrative portion, that your review type would vary based on a large differentiation like that. Like all warehouse employees would get one style and all administrative would get the other. But generally speaking, you would want that process to be consistent. So what I would want to avoid would be if you have 5 departments of each 10 employees, of having a different review style for each one of those. That probably wouldn't work super well in terms of gathering consistent information.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, you might have two different approaches based on different um, areas of work within your organization. And I apologize, you guys. I forgot to turn off my email, so you keep hearing these dings. That's me. Sorry about that. All right, well, let's dive into the types of reviews. The first one that I have here is what we just call a basic review, and you can call it whatever you'd like, but just for sake of discussion today, we've sort of named these reviews. This one is the best for an organization that's in its early stages, or if reviews are a new concept and you're looking for some formality. They tend to work well for work that doesn't change too frequently or is methodical in nature, such as hospitality or healthcare. And this is probably what a lot of you are sort of using right now is, 5 to 10 questions plus a rating scale, and you do this at least once a year. And there's nothing wrong with this type of review at all. And like we said here, it's really great for someone or an organization that's new to the process. Some of these other types of reviews that we'll talk about in a second might be too overwhelming for people that are not accustomed to having these conversations or taking the time to really think through these types of things. So it could be that you start with this and then ramp up, sort of launch a pilot program using this type of review and then go from there. Just a word on rating scales. You'll see rating scales pop up in a couple of these, and I didn't do a whole slide on rating scales. We could have gone down a rabbit hole just on rating scales alone, but you just want to make sure that if you do use a rating scale, that it's consistent. The definitions of each spot on that scale are clearly defined. That would be a great thing to socialize with managers ahead of time, just because otherwise rating scales can be real tricky. I mean, they're only as good as the consistency among them, right? So if a 10 means something different to somebody, it means an 8 to somebody else, then it's, in my opinion, doesn't really serve its purpose. But we definitely recommend that in addition to the rating scale, there's also some free-form questions and narrative that you add into this type of review, even if it's a basic review. Emily, anything else to add on this one?
No, I think you did a great job. I think, like you mentioned, this is kind of what everyone thinks of when they think of a performance review. And to your point, that doesn't mean that it's outdated or not good. There are a lot of times when, it's the standard for a reason, right? So if you're unsure where to start, this is probably a great place to start, even if you end up adjusting it slightly. And then to your point, Lesley, like I think you really hit it on the head with rating scales. They're beneficial and they're what we recommend for companies that are new to performance reviews, because it sort of sets a barometer of how comfortable are employers with having these discussions. What does good performance look like? But there does need to be a common understanding between managers of what those various ratings mean.
Yeah, and also I would guess, and correct me if you disagree, Emily, but going over with the employee who's about to be reviewed, what the ratings, what a 5 means, or what an excellent means, just so they know, or having that in writing on the review form so they can have a chance to see what this barometer is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really key. You know, the most common rating scale that we see is like a 5-point rating scale. And like you said, I could talk about this for a really long time, but you know, one thing that's really common with that 5-point rating scale is the goal is a 3, right? 3 is sort of, hey, you're meeting expectations. You're doing everything you need to do. Sometimes you're overperforming, maybe sometimes you're underperforming a little, but in general, no complaints. And we sort of live in a society now where we're so survey based and or feedback based, and you know everyone wants the 10 out of 10. So setting that expectation with managers and employees that if your average rating is a 3, you're doing everything you need to do, you're doing a good job. If you don't have that conversation and the employee is expecting to get a 5 in every area, which is generally reserved for far exceeding expectations, and some employees might have 1 or 2, some may have none, and that's okay. That could be a really disappointing and demotivating process. So that's a really good point of making sure that the employees understand it too. And we do recommend having it in writing. It serves as a really good guide for the discussion itself, but also it's a great visual reminder to the manager and the employee of what those numbers actually mean.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. And as in my early years of managing people, I was always tempted to just give everybody 5s because I, didn't have quite the either the confidence or the training to understand that that's not doing them any favors. They need to have somewhere to go, So the 3 to 5 range is where they need to be, and 3 and 4 are absolutely okay.
Absolutely.
All right, so the next type of review I call integrated because it's a little bit more sophisticated in that it invites a bit more specific feedback. It invites the employee to be measured against both the organization's goals and the department's goals. So it's a bit more work for the manager because they need to go in and really think about what the goals are and the focus areas are that they're measuring this person against. So it works best for an organization with really clearly defined mission, vision, and core values so that you can properly, so that the employees know what those are already going into it and they have an understanding. And so when they're in the review itself, they'll know that if integrity is a core value, it won't be a surprise to them. And then the feedback piece of it, we need to have, this is probably for an organization with a little bit of a thicker skin and has been exercising that muscle of feedback more, even if it's outside of a review process. Feedback doesn't just have to occur during a review. This is really great if your managers are accustomed to just sort of checking in with people and being like, hey, Emily, how's it going? Can you, tell me about what your challenges are this week or what's been a success? And sort of, if that's part of the culture, this review works a bit better. But there are also metrics in this one too. There are rating scales and more of the narrative conversation. So we're not abandoning the rating scale here. We're just sort of beefing up the narrative side of things and making that rating scale a bit more specific to actual defined goals. And then that last bullet sort of speaks to the second bullet, which is, when the employees are involved in the progression of their jobs and careers. So they're really asked to reflect, to give feedback, to professionally develop throughout the year, even if the review itself only takes place once or twice a year. The format, like I said, is 2 parts. So you measuring against company goals and values, and then measuring against team goals and priorities. And then there's a rating scale plus development opportunities in each area, which typically you don't see in more of a basic format. The development opportunities, you really have to put some thought into that. Instead of just saying this person is a 4, you need to say here it's a 4, and how can I help them get to a 5 or a 4 plus? And then there's also, for those of you who are more of the tacticians among us, what are some tangible items or tasks for the employees and the employee plus the manager to put into place to get to meet their goals? And so that's sort of a different spin on it because you're putting in, you're recommending together, you're sort of deciding together what are some tactical steps we can take to get to this, to move the ball down the field. And that's just requires a bit more critical thinking. And then we recommend these to be at least semi-annually, because again, if you only do it once a year, the development opportunities and certainly the tangible items and tasks might fall by the wayside. What else on this one, Emily?
Yeah, I think you did a great job. But the one way that I often will position this to clients when they're thinking about it and trying to decide which is the best fit is the basic version, the one we previously discussed, is pretty heavily top down, right? It's usually prepared fully by the manager before the meeting even takes place. The conversation is probably a lot more directive in nature. And then this is a pretty collaborative approach. So oftentimes a review like this might involve a self reviews that is completed beforehand. So the manager is sort of looking at the employee's comments or feelings about their performance as they're completing this prior to the meeting. And then in presenting it in the meeting, the expectation is that the employee is going to be participative, right? They're going to respond, and there's going to be a dialogue about what that rating is or about that development opportunity. So it does require that employees are comfortable doing that and speaking about performance, and also that managers are comfortable having those discussions as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The collaborative nature is really the differentiator here. Okay, so free form is a sort of a different approach where, again, it's best for an organization that has some experience in performance management. It also is good for organizations where the employee roles and responsibilities they change. They might be a moving target. It's not a repetitive function. That could be a project, because it's project-based work. Things might be different in first quarter than second quarter. And then this is also something that can be done in a sort of a more frequent pace with shorter review meetings that address different topics. So as the name suggests, it's a bit more discussion based. So there's no rating scale. The supervisor is asked to answer questions such as, given what I know of this person's performance, and if it were my money, would I award this person the highest possible compensation increase and bonus? Would I always want them on my team? So it's a different approach. There's no rating scale. It's inviting the managers to really sort of step back and apply a lens that they might not be applying in the other types of reviews, and maybe looking a bit longer term. The assumption is that this employee would be, is seeking growth opportunities, wants to stay around in the department for a while. And so we recommend this to be administered quarterly if you can pull that off. And of course, it goes without saying that for all of these, you should document everything. And if you're a Dominion Payroll client, our iSolve platform has an area where you can actually administer all of this online, and we can build that out for you if you'd like. What else on the free form, Emily, that you'd like to point out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the really important call out here of when this is a good fit is for project-based work, like you mentioned. This is also one that we see people gravitate towards if they're very experienced in performance reviews, or maybe their the culture of their organization is just that, they have a very relaxed, informal startups will sometimes use this. So all of the people on their team, even though the company is new, are usually pretty experienced at doing what they do. And they don't like the formality of things like a rating scale, but still like to have documentation of performance. So the questions that are on it might change, but usually it's pretty short. Maybe it's 4 or 5 questions, and then the employer will answer them and there will be a discussion. But then on the project-based project-based nature, even though we recommend quarterly, this works great if you have an organization where a lot of people are doing the same role. So one example, I have a client that's an architecture firm, and so the majority of their staff are architects or designers. And so on a given project, someone might be leading it, someone just might be contributing. And then those are long-term projects, right? Building a commercial building takes time. So they do their reviews rather than saying like, okay, we're going to do them strictly every quarter at the end of every project. So, when the ribbon is cut on the building, we're going to do reviews, and that will look different for employee whose name is Ted, who led this project, but maybe didn't lead the other. The conversation about how that went is going to look different. So they take a more free-form approach. So that's a great way to think a little further about whether or not this is a good fit for you. This probably isn't a good fit if you're uncomfortable having discussions about feedback, or if your management team is really inexperienced. It can seem on its face like the easiest option, like I just answer 4 questions and that's great. But you can run into situations if your team isn't trained on what's appropriate to discuss during performance reviews, or how to be consistent in that approach, where one manager takes it seriously and provides a lot of really good feedback, and then other managers who just don't fully understand the process or aren't comfortable with it, could have risky discussions in this realm if they don't know kind of where the boundaries should lie around discussing performance.
Emily, you mentioned startups. I have quite a few smaller clients who, their org chart is pretty flat. They don't have a ton of management in place, not yet anyway. So what would you recommend? Maybe there's there's the founder / owner, and then maybe there's a chief operating officer, or, chief marketing officer, and then everybody else is, to your point, sort of, they're all software engineers or they're all architects. Like, I think the project-based approach is interesting. I like that a lot. Is there anything else you would recommend for that type of growing company?
Yeah, so freeform could be a really good fit. And to your point, it doesn't have to be project based. You could even break it into sort of like defined groups, and it could switch every quarter. So if you have someone that, let's say that you have, again, 5 groups of 10 employees, you could designate maybe the more senior person as being the one that provides the feedback, or you could rotate and say, and it almost becomes a 360 in a way, which I know we're going to chat about a little bit. But if your organization is comfortable with that, you could just have everyone sort of trade off reviews or assign cohorts. So employee A will review employee B, and then they'll switch and provide feedback. So that could be an option. I think that does really require a flat organization where that makes sense to do. And it would mean that you would have to have a really strong buy-in, because if all of your line employees or everyone is contributing equally to the success of performance reviews, there's not a strong director of it. Everyone has to be really fully bought in for it to be successful.
Right. So there's definitely some prep work in advance for any of these reviews, but certainly for the freeform one, so that there are some guideposts in place and consistency among these conversations. All right. So you just mentioned 360 or peer reviews. I get quite a few questions about these types of reviews, and they're intriguing. I've been through them before. They definitely have pros and cons. And so rather than going through the best for and formats rubric like we've done for these other ones, I wanted to share the pros and cons, because these can be really great, but they can also be a little damaging if you're not in the right spot for them. So for those of you who aren't familiar, a 360 or peer review is essentially what it's saying here is it's asking peers to review one another. So the pros here are, it really expands their view of how their performance and their behavior affect others, which you might not always hear from people who are lateral and not, you're used to hearing feedback from your supervisor, but not necessarily from someone who's on the same level as you. It can be very eye-opening. It can be valuable. provide a real opportunity for personal and professional growth. If Emily and I are able to help each other out in that regard, for instance, if we work together, then, I think that would be really helpful for both of us. And then it also increases the subject's perception of reliability. So basically, usually peer reviews, you're reviewed by more than one peer. And so if you hear the same themes coming from multiple sources, you're less likely to sort of dismiss that as being like, oh, Emily's just sensitive to this thing. If I hear both Emily and Kim say the same thing about me, then I'm like, okay, well, maybe this is something I need to work on. And this is reliable input. And then you'd be more willing to make some changes. So those are the pros. Before I switch to the cons, Emily, anything to add on this one?
No, maybe at the end, but I would definitely agree with the pros here. The other call out I think is 360 reviews and whether or not they're beneficial is a pretty polarizing topic. So if you have strong feelings one way or the other, that's okay. I think that this shouldn't be viewed as something that you eventually have to do. For it to fit, it really has to make sense for your organization and probably shouldn't be a decision that is undertaken lightly because, like Lesley mentioned, it can have detrimental effects if not done right.
So I've only done peer reviews at one organization, and I was one of the peers reviewing other peers, and they were reviewing me, and it worked. It worked for us because our management team had committed to investing in a lot of emotional intelligence and self-awareness sort of assessments for the team. So every new hire went through. We took the Insights Discovery assessment, which is the same. I mean, it's all Myers-Briggs, DISC. It's all based on sort of the same theories. We just preferred this Insights Discovery model. But so we had this sort of foundation to go on. We already knew a bit about our strengths and weaknesses, our communication styles, how we prefer to show up in the world, how we handle conflict. And so when we got to peer reviews as sort of a second step later on, it was still, you still never know what you're going to get back. But we were a bit more prepared personally and as a team to hear feedback that might otherwise have been either seemingly out of left field or hurt or perceived as being hurtful. So I'll just add that in there that it's, when assessing if this is the right thing for you, one of the things you should ask yourself is like, is my team pretty self-aware? Like, do they have some tools in their back pocket to be able to hear feedback that might not always be super sunny? And then what tools can if we don't have the tools and we really want to do these types of reviews, what tools can we give them ahead of time to make sure that this is a productive process and not one that is counterproductive?
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. Sorry to jump in there, but
Yeah.
I think that it really does require that the group that is doing this has really firmly established trust in one another. So the other thing that I would maybe look at that I don't think we mentioned was this could be a scenario where this isn't something you do for your whole organization, but possibly only for your management team if you feel that they're ready. And I think one other thing to consider in assessing readiness is your turnover. I think this can be a really valuable tool when you have limited turnover. So if a lot of your employees have been with you for 5+ years, the chances are that even if your teams aren't super close, they've developed some level of trust. And then also, it might be really difficult for a standard review to assess progression or assess performance. If you've been in your role for 5 years, maybe there's not an opportunity to move into a different one that's specialized. That process can get a little stale. Like, hey, Lesley, you're doing great. Keep up the good work. Keep doing the same thing.
Right.
And peer reviews can be a great way to shed a different light on that. So if you have been doing reviews and you feel that that's a little stale and you feel that there's trust amongst your team, that's when this can really work well.
Yeah. I mean, the one of the questions that my peers had to answer about me was uh, list 3 words that describe Lesley on a good day and list 3 words that describe her on a bad day. And we each had to do that for other people too. So not only were we receiving the feedback, but we were also providing it. So I was trying very hard to think critically about my coworkers' behavior, and I didn't want to offend them, but I also wanted this to be a productive conversation. So it's much more of a two-way street. Everybody is like almost sort of equalizes the vulnerability. And so, like Emily said, it might be best to just concentrate on one group of people. Maybe that's a management team, or maybe it's a department that is particularly suited for this type of thing. They've been there for a while. They've all worked together for a long time. They have that level of trust, because otherwise, if I didn't trust my coworkers, some of the words that I got back, you know, I wouldn't necessarily have trusted that that it was reliable. So just some food for thought there. That said, like we've sort of touched on already, the cons of these types of reviews is that they can be uncomfortable and sometimes upsetting. Now, we've mentioned anonymity here among the reviewers, and you can do this in two ways. You can make it anonymous or you can make it not anonymous. The one that I went through was not anonymous, but again, we had already gone through as a team a lot of trust building and self-awareness exercises. So we did not, so I knew who was assessing my good days and bad days. And I actually think I was able to choose who was providing me, who was reviewing me. I don't know that that's always the case, but for some reason we did it that way. Sometimes an employee is going to want additional information, like, hey, if you tell me that I'm like this on a bad day, can you give me an example? Can you be more clear? And you need to be, your employees need to be prepared to actually elaborate on things, so that, again, their answers to these questions have to be thought through. And not all people are comfortable doing that. And then there could be an extra time-consuming component. Maybe a lot of people layer on peer reviews in addition to a more traditional manager and employee discussion. So it's an extra layer of work. And then if you, as the HR person or the ops person, is the one who's organizing this type of thing, there are a few more moving parts than if you were just to go more of a traditional route. So those are the big cons. I know we've talked about ways to sort of mitigate some of these, and depending on your organization, you might be able to get get to the pros list and sort of avoid some of these pitfalls. What else on this, Emily?
The one thing I would add here would just be around deciding whether or not to make them anonymous or not. And this is just my opinion. So I would really err on the side of caution if you're thinking about keeping them anonymous, right? Because the goal of this is to receive and provide really intentional feedback. And to Lesley's point, there might be follow-up questions, or there's a great way to have discussions based upon this information. Reviews only work if there's a process that follows it, right? If there's action associated with it. And that's really hard to do when you're getting or giving anonymous feedback. But it does become really easy then to be overly harsh or to look at providing critical feedback that maybe isn't kind or isn't going to be beneficial. And that isn't to say that feedback is always easy to receive, but if you're able to sort of hide behind who provides it, I think there might be a situation where that works, but I think in the majority of cases, if your team isn't ready to sort of commit to the feedback that they're providing, it might be a sign that they're not quite ready yet. I've been through this a couple of times too. And Lesley, one time we were able to pick who reviewed us, and then one time we were not. And in selecting who I chose, I picked the people that I worked with the most frequently because I thought they'd be able to provide the most robust feedback. But we did really have a strong relationship. So when there was critical feedback, even though it was hard to read, it was pretty easy to say, like, I'd like to learn more about that. Because to your point, if you're using these words to describe me on a bad day and I don't think I come across that way, or I'm like, oh gosh, I don't want to give that message, like, hey, could you have some examples? Or and if that's anonymous, then that really closes that ongoing conversation loop as well.
Yeah, and it's distracting because then you try to start figuring out who said Who
Oh,
made
it
the
becomes a game of Clue.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then so you're distracted from the actual feedback itself. Yeah, that's a good point. I think I think you should be able to know who's reviewing you and be involved in that decision. So yeah, that's my preference as well. And the last type of review we'll go over here is what we just call informal. And this is best for organizations that have more of a coaching culture. These are more frequent. Um, this might be a monthly discussion, certainly quarterly. You should still document it, but this is more of a probably for a more sophisticated organization that has a lots of experience with this type of performance management, um, and that they really are supervisors are really are comfortable having more of a coaching conversation as opposed to sort of just rating people. And this one, Emily, what's the difference between this one really and free form? I feel like this one is much more of a more frequent touch bases, sort of open lanes of communication. It might not be a scheduled thing necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. So I sort of look at this as the client or the company that says, we don't do annual reviews, right? And so I've had clients say that in the past, like, we're just not interested in that. And then the follow-up question is, well, why is that, right? And are you actually still managing performance? And if yes, it usually looks like this. And so what it might look like is, well, I have a check-in with each of my employees every week, but once a month it's longer, and we talk about how things are going, or what the future looks like. And maybe there's not a form, where free form usually at least still has some set questions. It might only be a couple, but there's a clear guide of what you're going to be discussing. This might just be, we have informal check-ins and then I document it after the fact. But it's just a way for still keeping track, or still showing that you are coaching employees, that you are having discussions with them. So that's basically where it is. And we would encourage all employers to, I don't want to say at least do this, but if you're not having any discussions at all, there's not really a regulatory requirement for annual reviews or semi-annual reviews. But if you're not ever having check-ins with your team about how they're feeling, how things are doing, or you don't have a process in place for providing feedback when things aren't going well, that's definitely a deficit in terms of best practice. So this can either be something that is really robust, that they've worked really hard to achieve, and that there is a formal process, but it's maybe not a review, or just a discussion around how do you document performance if you're not doing any sort of formal review.
Yeah, and we haven't mentioned COVID in a while, but back to the pandemic, I would think in particular, if you have a remote workforce, this it's very important to keep, even if you do more formal reviews, to have check-ins um, with your teammates, and just to see how they're doing, because if they're feeling isolated and sort of as if they're working in a vacuum, and that can sort of exacerbate that feeling. And then once they get back to the office, if that's the direction you go, then it's everyone sort of thrown back into this situation, and they would probably feel better if they knew where they stood at that point. All right. So just quick reminders. The most important components are that the reviews are consistently conducted, so that does require some project management on your part, and that the questions on the review are relevant to your company's goals and culture. So if you download a template from the web, you should tailor that to actually be relevant to your organization. And the ways you can do that after you've decided on the type of review is to get specific with it. Add specific assessment criteria based on the job requirements for that individual. You can, like we said, you can choose to add a rating system, but we recommend really defining what that scale, what the notches on the scale mean, and making sure everybody is aware. You could consider changing the questions on a seasonal basis. So for instance, in our company, the end of the calendar year is our very busiest time, and we're just now getting out of it. It takes up for most of the first quarter, and it could be that we use a different rubric to assess the way that our people work together during that time. And then well-defined goals. So we mentioned goals a little bit earlier. Um, Goals are only as good as the tactics and commitment and focus that you apply to them. Otherwise, they're just goals on a shelf. So putting goals together, I mean, you've heard of different types of goals. The most common one would be SMART goals. To me, and Emily might disagree, but to me, I don't really care what types of goals they are, just as long as there are goals, as long as they are relevant, they make sense for the specific department and job. They could sort of border on the personal, for instance, somebody, one of my team members, one of her goals this year is to just be a healthier individual, which impacts her work, right? Because she's healthier and feels good about herself, she's going to be more productive. So to me, I like goals that are just well thought out and defined and discussed. It doesn't really matter to me if you follow a specific goal rubric, but certainly if that works better for you, then definitely rely on that.
Yeah, I actually totally agree. I have a pretty relaxed management approach just in my own, management experience day to day. The textbook thing to think about, though, if you're new to goals or if you're not really sure where to start, is to think about setting goals that sort of filter up to your communities or your organization's core values. So if you're not sure where to start, or you do really prefer a lot more structure, sometimes organizations will pick one of their core values and each employee will need to set a goal that relates back to that core value. Or if you have company, OKRs or larger goals, having the employees specifically funnel up to that is really the traditional approach. But like Lesley mentioned, my preference is really that the goal is meaningful to the employee and they feel like they're able to make change within the realm of whatever their position happens to be. And if an employee is performing better and doing their job well, or is just even happier at work, then I'm of the opinion that that benefits the company, even if it doesn't directly link to that. So there are definitely two schools of thought, and you can choose whichever works best for you.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. And also to your point, in providing guidance to both managers and employees what a goal is. So instead of, for instance, when we did our reviews and just started our review process in December, our HR department provided some examples of the types of goals they were looking for. And yes, they wanted us to tie them to our company goals and our department goals, but also they wanted them to be meaningful. So instead of just saying, I want to perform better, you need to be more specific. And that's where that well-defined piece comes in. And so that could be part of your sort of educational process as you go into this, as you introduce this program to your team. Emily, we have a question, which I think I'll go ahead and answer, even though we have a couple more slides, and I know we're getting close to 12, so we'll see how far we go. But Marie asks, how do you manage reviews with a leadership team wanting very concrete numbers along with customizing the review? So it seems like she's asking, they want a standard sort of rating scale across the board, but then with the opportunity to provide some specific narrative to that individual. Is that how you're hearing that?
Yeah, I think that's how I'm hearing it. So, a lot of managers or companies are very data driven. And so managing employee performance can be really tricky if you're that type of person or manager, or you work for that type of company. And that isn't to say that is bad. So, but if you want kind of that middle approach, that second option is probably where you would want to lean into. So you could keep that, let's just say it's the 5-point rating scale, but then also have a comment section under each one of the values or items that you're rating so that there is still more of a discussion. So that would definitely be an option. And then a lot of companies that end up using like very concrete data points for things like raises, that review still works really well. So let's say that you rate someone on 10 different things, they can come up with a cumulative average, right? So even maybe if they're weaker in one area and stronger in another, let's say that their average is a 3.6, then you could look at where they fall on that scale within your whole organization for things like assigning raises. The other thing that I took possibly from that is, maybe your company does have really structured like KPIs or OKRs or just goals and metrics that really are how success is defined at your organization. You could include those in the performance rating. So it doesn't always have to be rating someone on things like productivity or kind of those, amorphous character traits. One item could be, achieve a customer satisfaction score of, I don't know, 4.6 out of 5 or whatever the goal happens to be. And then it could almost be pass fail. Like, did the person achieve it? Did they not? If you're going to do that, I think it is good to have some sort of discussion related to it and not just leave it at that. Like, if they fell short, what are the things that you think they could do to get there next time? Or if they just did great and blew it out of the water, like, what did they do to make it that way? But you could definitely integrate things like metrics or KPIs into your performance review.
Maria, I hope that answered your question. Okay, we just have a couple minutes left. I have 2 more slides, and these are our handy tip slides, and we've already mentioned a couple of these. So this is just a sort of a roundup of a lot of things we've already discussed. But the first one here is to make sure that you review performance for the entire period. Don't fall into that recency trap that Emily mentioned earlier on that, where you base judgments on recent or isolated events only. Consider the employee based on the standards expected for that job, given the employee's length of time in the job. So that's, if they just started a couple months ago, you need to give that a little bit of consideration. Summarize the employee's performance since the last review or from date of hire if this is the employee's first review. So if you take a recommendation and do more frequent reviews than annual, so say you do semi-annual, then you're looking at the last 6 months, unless there's something that, you're building on the prior 6 months, but the review period in question is the immediate prior 6 months. And then some of the factors in the review itself will vary according to position in terms of their importance. Obviously, like if you have a front desk manager or customer service point person, there are some factors there that, client services and approachability and reliability, those will be really important for that position, and less so for somebody who is doing data entry all day and never interacts with anybody. Definitely back up your ratings decisions with examples and comments to support them. Don't, especially if you have large departments and you're reviewing a lot of people, try not to sort of fall into a consistent routine or pattern. Jobs are different, individuals are different, the various factors and circumstances might be different for each one. So try to not fall into the trap of just giving everybody a 4 and then moving on, because that's not going to help anybody. It does require more of your time. Like we said earlier, when you meet with the employee, review that rating scale if you use one, so that everybody understands what each rating means. And if you are in a position to review the rating scale with your management team, so that everybody understands at that level as well, I would do that. Give the employee time to make comments or ask questions throughout the meeting. Talk through each section. Make sure you allow for enough time and don't just blow through it. They might not be comfortable responding quickly to this type of feedback. They might need a minute to process. I myself am like that. I usually leave meetings and then 30 minutes later, I have, lots of questions that I just needed 30 minutes to come up with. So give them an opportunity, even after the technical review period is over. I always like to say to my direct reports, you might think of something after we leave here today. My door is always open. And so that it's not just something where they feel like they don't say it in the moment, then it doesn't count. And then once that review is finished, save a copy, have them sign it, and then have them sign it, give them a copy, and then put a copy in their personnel file. So you can build on that information going forward. And of course, it goes without saying that when you come up to the next review, you can look at that last one and build on that. Any other tips or expanding on ones we have here, Emily?
Yeah, just to build up upon a couple of them. So the one from the last slide and the one that you just sort of closed with, don't forget to look at the past review. That's a great tool for you as a manager when you're completing the one that's coming up. So like Lesley mentioned, it's great to be able to provide a recap. It's also a really good barometer to just do an internal check of how well you are using that rating system if you're using one. So, let's say that you have an average performing employee. It wouldn't be uncommon for them to score, a 3.2 one time and a 3.6 another time. And that wouldn't really be cause for any alarm. And maybe they even did that backwards, right? 3.6 last time, 3.2 now. That wouldn't really mean like, oh, we need to put them on a PIP or, oh, things aren't going well. But you probably are rating them consistently. Whereas if you feel like their performance has stayed pretty much the same and you realize that they rated an average of a 4.1 last time and they're only a 3.2 now, just double check, am I being more harsh this time? Is there actually something that's happened that maybe we need to have a bigger discussion about? So you want to make sure that if there is a big swing in that rating, and hopefully it's a big swing upward and that's great, but that if there is a big change, that should definitely be something that you focus your upcoming discussion on. The next one is on the second bullet about, guarding against letting your appraisal just sort of be viewed as something that you do to check the box, or what we call leniency of just sort of failing to address or have those hard conversations. So like Lesley mentioned, if you just kind of give everyone a 3 or give everyone a 4, there's a lot of pitfalls there. Number one, employees do actually like to know where they fall, even though having those conversations can be difficult. Employees can't fix problems that they don't know exist. And it could lead to a situation where the employee becomes disengaged because they can tell that their manager doesn't like them. Or it could even lead to you resenting an employee if you haven't brought up a problem and it's really bothering you, but you haven't taken the time to discuss it. From a fairness standpoint, or even assigning raises, it can become really difficult to differentiate if everyone on your team rates the same as well. So I'm sure there could be situations where you have a really well-performing team that everyone would be in that acceptable range, and that would be fine. But if that really isn't the case, then you want to make sure that you're having those tough conversations.
Yeah, and if your management team could benefit from some training around having difficult conversations, that would be a great way to prep them and prepare them and make them feel more comfortable. Because like I said, specifically, if they are younger managers, new to management, typically a lot of managers get to where they are because they were really good at their job, but not necessarily have they been trained in managing people. And certainly the performance reviews are a big part of that. So anything you can do to give them the tools that they need to have better, more productive conversations, even if those conversations are uncomfortable, like Emily said, it will benefit everybody in the long run. So investing in that is a smart way to go.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I had was on your comment about, giving people time to sort of absorb things. So we always recommend, at the end saying like, hey, do you have any questions, or like, how do you feel about this? And it can be really overwhelming, especially if you did have to have a tough conversation. So it can be difficult to deal with like that awkward silence at the end if they're like, nope, don't have any questions, or they just seem sort of shocked. So I think it's really good to feel empowered, but also to empower your managers to say to your team, I know this was a lot of information. So even though you said you don't have questions now, please feel free to come back to me. Or if the employee is just silent, say, please don't feel like you need to think of everything everything now? Do you want to schedule a meeting a week from now so that we can, take 15 minutes or 30 minutes to talk through your impressions once you've had a time to really sit with this information? So if you have an employee in that situation, definitely feel free to go that route.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good approach. Well, everybody, we have passed the 12 o'clock mark. If you have a quick question, now's the time to key it in, or you can email it to questions@dominionpayroll.com, and that will route to me and I will answer them for you. We appreciate your time today, Emily. I know you're super busy, so we always appreciate when you can partner with us and lend your expertise.
Of course, it's great to be here.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks, topic TBA, but we'll get that out on our website and via email to our people who are signed up. So hopefully you'll join us again in 2 weeks. Everybody have a great afternoon and we'll talk soon. Thanks, Emily.